Namaste, Sraddhalu,
Namaste.
and namaste to all disciples, devotees, and seekers on the Mother's birthday. Tonight, Sraddhalu is going to speak on, I believe, the fourth part of the synthesis of yoga, the chapter, The Intuitive Mind. This is the third method, and it also will continue through the record of yoga.
Thank you. Thank you, Narad. Happy birthday to all present, to all of you. And the mother often greeted us on her birthday by saying it is everyone's birthday. And so bon fête to all. Over the last two sessions, we have gone in depth in the practice that Sri Aurobindo describes for opening our consciousness to the intuitive mind. These two sessions I consider, in reviewing, to be among the two most important of all that we have covered so far, because of the depth, density, and the practical import of all that we have discussed. In the first of these, Sri Aurobindo described to us the various ways by which the intuition develops, and the first base that we have to set in the practice of a complete stillness, which must eventually enter all of our parts of our being, in the thought, in the will, in the feelings, in the action, and even in the mind, to enter into further reason, the will, mental sense, intelligence, etc. And through this stillness, a base is set in which that which comes from above can descend without being distorted, without being mixed, coated, or otherwise limited. And he describes the various kinds of limitation. This method also is natural to those who are turned to the way of knowledge as their starting point. The second method that we saw, but one important point of the first method, that alone is not enough. And we discussed in detail what makes it that the practice of stilling of the mind opens us to something higher. It does not do it automatically, and you must make that additional effort. The previous session, we dwelt on the second method, where Sri Aurobindo pointed out this is more natural to those who follow the line of bhakti and bhakti through karma. And the turn then is towards the secret self within, and to follow its voice, its impulsion, its command. And this, he says, has a direct intuitive character. It's not the intuition. Its influence coming forward and leading us, again, he says, has a highly spiritualized character, but is not yet spiritual. So the result of this is, while it prepares us and builds the first movement of the influence of intuition, it cannot be complete because this is not the highest center of our being, and it is not supramental nor directly led by the supramental. So its limitations are that it can be luminous, even sometimes intensely luminous, but narrow, mixed with lower emotions, sometimes excited, troubled, unbalanced, exaggerated, etc., and having a miraculous character. This is an important point I did not fully elaborate. What makes a miracle is that a higher power works through a lower grade, not in its native zone. So what happens through the heart's intuition is that you have something of the intuition, but coming through a lesser, murkier, or mixed substance. And so this sometimes he says can also at times be injurious to the harmonized perfection of the being. So yet these first two methods lay the base for something which was much more direct, And it is this which we will take up today, the third method, where we directly open to the intuitive consciousness. If the first two have been put in practice sufficiently, this direct opening becomes not only easy, but the action of the descending intuition becomes more spontaneous, more free, less mixed, and also effortless. In our discussion last time, we also covered some of the questions that came from practices, as well as we took up in depth the practices relating to raising our intelligence, raising the IQ. And I think it's the first time that I have covered that topic with as much depth. Earlier, I have covered it in fragments, looking at certain practices depending on age groups, but this was the one where I have done it most completely. Nevertheless, there will be a little more which will come in the third and fourth methods, which we will discuss, which align to that. We also briefly spoke about further practices for deepening beyond the descent of the peace. So that's why, looking back in terms of the content, I consider those two sessions among the most important. For those of you who feel drawn to take this up in depth of practice, I would highly recommend for you to review them. Review them, pause, internalize, and put into practice every little thing that you find immediately applicable or helpful. We move now to the third method of the intuition, and in the chapter called The Intuitive Mind in the Synthesis of Yoga. Remember, we are still part of the study of the record of yoga, and we are taking up the text from the Synthesis of Yoga because it is here that Sri Aurobindo fully elaborates all that he has to say about the topic. In the record of yoga, there are notes to himself primarily, and in essential summary form. In the comments he makes in the disciples' notebooks, again, there are preliminary starting points for the practice, but a comprehensive treatment you find here in the Synthesis of Yoga, and it is completely aligned with what he personally experienced and put into practice, but with the richness of all the nuances that he discovered and developed during his practice. So we come to the third method now. Remember, the second method was through the heart, but it is indirect because it is not directly the intuition nor spiritual. So now we come to the third method where we go directly. The highest organized center of our embodied being and of its action in the body is the supreme mental center, figured by the yogic symbol of the 1,000-petaled lotus, Sraddhalu, and it is at its top and summit that there is the direct communication with the supramental levels. It is then possible to adopt a different and a more direct method. And then we continue. So this first sentence also one could easily read through and say, oh yes, so we just have to focus on this. But as with all of Sri Aurobindo's writings, there are nuances here which are absolutely essential to appreciate. First of all, he says, the highest organized center. What does he mean by that? Then of our embodied being and its action in the body. What does he mean by that? And the supreme mental center and the yogic symbol of the 1,000-petal lotus. Why is that a symbol? What does it convey? And then he says, at the top of the 1,000-petal lotus and at the summit of that is the direct communication with the supramental. What does that mean? So we'll just look at each of these and you will see there is so much that he has conveyed in this one simple sentence that a casual reader would just have read through and said, yes, okay, so it's here, that's all. So the highest organized center of our embodied being. He doesn't say of our whole being. Our whole being is across so many levels of consciousness. The embodied being is when all these higher levels of consciousness embody, that is, integrate with the biology and get now bound and stuck in the biology. The moment this happens, all the higher gradations of consciousness that we are and have now got bound in a single heavy, sticky, dulling, dark substance of the physical consciousness and substance. So all those levels have got embedded here. What happens to all those centers? Where in the subtle body, for example, we might have experienced many states simultaneously, in the biology, all those states get dulled down, and they get also mapped in a physical sequence and physical locations. So, in the way it has been organized by nature's evolution, necessarily, and there's a natural rationale to it, it begins bottom up. In the lowest levels of animals, you have the lowest gradations of consciousness. As they evolve, one more level organizes itself, and one more, and one more, and so on. So, through these gradations of consciousness, through along the spine, they say, or along the general levels of our physical body, upward rising to the top of the head. Generally speaking, the chest region is associated with the higher vital, the abdominal region with the lower vital, and below, in the region of the knees, is the subconscious. The feet becomes the inconscient, or below the feet is the inconscient. The throat center, Sri Aurobindo describes as the externalizing mind. So mind is not properly there, the mind is above, but as it turns to externalize, it fixes into the physical machinery and articulates itself. And that's why the throat becomes also the physical organization of the speech. But the mind proper generally is in the region of the head, near the region of the brain, in the center, mostly somewhere, which in that area we call the third eye. Now, actually, in the subtle body, these become focal points of energy. In the biology, as these embed themselves, embodied being, so as they embed themselves, they also organize organs. The organs may not always be biological structures of lumps, but they may be focal points of the nervous system, which is often the case with those centers we call the chakras. And each of these focal points then further projects and extends the energy from the chakras into functions and organs. So you'll notice there is a rationale to it in the higher part of the chest. Let's say the chest being the higher vital is also where we draw energy by breathing of the lungs. And abdominal region being the lower vital is where we draw energy by digestion, which is a lower grade of substance that is taken, digested, and absorbed into the biology, and so on. In the head region, we have the focal point of thought, and that's why when you're thinking, you say, I am thinking, and you point to your head. You don't point to your heart and say, I am thinking. The heart you point to and say, I am feeling, isn't it? So you say head. And when you have a problem which you don't have a solution for, you cover your head, cover your eyes when you don't want to face something. There's an interesting observation. Children who are born blind, so have logically, technically, no association of sight with this location of physical eyes. Even they, when they are faced with some very disturbing news or something which is embarrassing, they will place their hand as if to cover the eyes and the forehead and say, oh, like we say, oh God, it's something like this. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the physical eyes. It has to do with this grade of consciousness, which is spanning the head, the top of the head, the brain, down to the eyes, because the brain is also behind the eyes. So in the embodied being, we have a sequence of this structure. Of these, therefore, the highest would be where? Obviously, in the body, therefore, the top of the head. So the highest organized center of our embodied being. Again, the word organized, suggesting that in fact we have higher centers. Just above the head is the intuitive, and above that is the supramental. Now, if you concentrate there, you won't get the intuition, you won't get the supramental. It's not a location where you'll get the supramental. It is just that in the subtle body, when that grade of consciousness gets sufficiently organized, then you will find the focal point of its action there, when it gets organized. When it is not organized, there is nothing there. So, if you rewind a few, million years, before the intellect was fully organized, even though this region of the structure of head existed, it did not have an organized consciousness. So in the ape, you can say, yeah, similar to the human head. Well, it does not work. They don't think here. at least not the way we do. They have their own way of, uh, let's say, expression of some kind of a, I will use the word emotional thought, but its center is not more naturally here, or even what is there is not organized. It's the organization of this which makes the human beings as a species capable of conscious, self-aware, intellectual thought. So, organizing is a critical term, Sri Aurobindo, you will find in Sri Aurobindo when he speaks of higher or inner levels of consciousness. The mother again speaks of this when she speaks of what happens when you go within. For most people, she says, if you just go behind the gross physical into the subtle physical layers, the consciousness there is not organized. So there is nothing. And you feel as if you're falling into a hole and there is nothing. So when you start meditating, you go in and it's all dark and whole and there is nothing. But for most people, the subtle physical is not organized. And even what goes beyond, let's say you are a bit organized there, you go further, there's a point where you can't go anymore. There is nothing. So organizing means literally forming a structure, substance, consciousness around which then activities can be coordinated. So we are able to have coherent thoughts because there is a focal point around which those thoughts are organized. In the Veda, this is described in this way, that the maruts are the thought impulses rising from emotions. They are chaotic. They run around everywhere in all directions. Their physical equivalent and representation is the strong winds and in a chaotic way. So when there's a storm approaching, you have sudden gusts of wind blowing in various directions, often changing rapidly. Those are the maruts. Indra is the lord of the mind, spiritual mind eventually, but let's say at a lower working. When Indra steps in, around him all the maruts coalesce and form like an army, structured, ordered lines around the center. Until he comes, you have chaotic, emotional, sentimental thoughts. This is generally what you will see in those who have not a developed power of intellect or reasoning. Sentimental types. The moment the Indra comes in, like a magnet, he draws all these together and organizes them and welds them into coherent, clear, structured thought. Where now seemingly contradictory movements of the maruts are structured to become complementary because there is a focal point. So this is an organizing center and an organizing faculty which we call intellect. Remove that and again you fall back to the maruts and their chaos. So when Indra is formed in us, the maruts are held in structure and order. So this is what is meant by organized center. Now from here you can have a coherent, rational life. But it has to have a focal point. That means it's organized. And then all of your life eventually has to be organized, including even your emotions. Someday, if you take the trouble to work around them, you will say, I don't like these emotions. I'm going to put them in the right place in relation to my highest understanding or my deepest aspiration or whatever focal point you may take for organizing them. But it has to be organized. As long as it is not organized, it is chaotic and you are a victim of that. And we would say then in that case, even your heart center or emotional center is not organized, is not developed. So the organized center of our embodied being, now you understand what that means. The highest organized center of our embodied being. That, he says, is this figured by the yogic symbol of the 1,000-petal lotus at the top of the head. What does that mean? The highest organized center. Do you feel yourself there something in your organization? You can speak of your center of thought here. You can speak of center of emotions here. But do you feel something there as center? No. I think 99%, maybe 100% among us would say, no, I don't feel it as the center for anything. That's because it is not organized. It has not been made an organized center for you When it does, you will actually feel yourself as if from here thinking, or maybe slightly above, as if you're thinking from there or living from there or taking decisions from there. This is a very important reference for you, that straight away you can say, that's not organized. Okay. So the highest organized center of our embodied being and of its action in the body. So it's not enough that you have an embodied organized center of, let's say, of your thoughts. From there, you want to move into action. Most people are not able to act purely from thought. You will remember I think it's a biblical phrase, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. I want to do, but I can't help it. My desires overwhelm me and compel me to do the opposite of what I know to be right. Why? Because the action center is often still centered in the emotions, and the thought center and the emotion centers are not connected. And so the organized thought does not act in the body, does not have an organized focal point for action in the body. So highest organized center of embodied being and of its action in the body, we make the distinction now, is the supreme mental center. So at the top of the head is still a mental center. That is the highest point of the mental center, figured by the yogic symbol of the 1,000-petaled lotus. So yogic symbol, a symbol, remember, is a higher truth represented on a lower grade. So the yogic symbol of 1,000-petaled lotus, conceive of a lotus and you have 1,000 petals. The Sanskrit word is Sahasra Dala. Dala is petal, Sahasra is 1,000. Why 1,000? Why not 992 or 800 something? Why 1,000? If you start actually taking it up and start counting, you might probably not find 1,000. So the 1,000 itself is a symbolic number. In the Vedic tradition, 100 represents all the gradations of consciousness in the involution and the evolution. So 7 planes, each principle repeated in each plane becomes 7 times 7, 49. In the descending involution and then in the ascending evolution. So 49 plus 49, it's the double stair of Jacob in the biblical tradition. And then you have the origin above and then the inconscience below. So plus 2, which makes for 100. So in the Vedic symbolism, 100 represents this totality of all planes of consciousness in the involution and the evolution all included. 1,000 represents each of these gradations opening out to its full potential tenfold. So multifacets on each of these. So it's a complete rich development of all possibilities, of all capacities, of all powers, all faculties, etc. So when you say 1,000-petaled lotus, it means it is the consciousness fully unfolding to its full potential of all possibilities. That's the idea behind it. Nevertheless, why is it lotus? You could have said 1,000-petal. You could have taken a flower with rays, which looks like the sun, or you could have made any other image. You could have perhaps taken a stone or a diamond with 1,000 facets or whatever. So in fact, when you look at the focal points of these centers of consciousness in the subtle body with the clairvoyant sight, they look like centers opening out, sometimes like a whirl, and they're very distinct facets which look like petals. So the image naturally, spontaneously corresponds to the shape of a flower. And when they're closed and not working, they look very narrow and the petals tend to close and blur into each other. When they are more conscious, more evolved, more developed, they seem to distinguish the facets of their powers more distinctly as if. And then if you look further into the petals, each petal is as if a whirl of energy and so on. There are descriptions of some of these you will find from some of the more reputed and reliable clairvoyants. I largely rely on descriptions I find from Ingo Swann, and he recommended 2 books particularly, which were the only ones that he found to be genuine in what they described of the shape, form, and the characteristics of these centers. And so at one point I was in a conversation with Mark O'Byrne, who has also this clairvoyant sight, And he told me, I've seen so many books with all these, it's all trash. Nobody has the real stuff. So then I told him, by the way, Ingo Swan says the same thing, but he recommends these two books. So I indicated to him which books, and he bought them. And then he came back after a few days. He said, this is the first book I found which actually shows it the way it is. Interesting. So this is just to point out that there's a lot of clutter out there, and it's useful to have some discrimination. So the turn of the flower-like appearance, and then, well, you could have said thousand-petaled flower. Why lotus? Why does Sri Aurobindo say lotus? Because Sanskrit word Sahasradala just says thousand-petaled. But it does not say Padma. It does not say lotus. So yes, there is a reason for that, because the lotus symbolizes the emergence of consciousness out of inconscience. In the symbolism in the physical world, it is from mud that it emerges and is rooted in the mud. Unlike the lily flower, which is rooted in the water and not in the mud. The lotus is embedded in the mud and rises out of the mud, floats right on top of the water, despite being rooted in the mud, and its leaves, floating on the side, are always dry, even though they're fully immersed in water. You can take out the lotus leaf and it's dry instantly. Put it back into the water, soak it all you want, take it out, and it's dry. So it can stay in the water and not be stuck, will not have the water stick to it. So it becomes a perfect yogic symbol of the consciousness liberated, embodied, rooted in biology, in matter, rising through gradations of consciousness in the waters, opening to the higher, and while being in the world, not being of the world, or being free of it in a deeper equality, etc. So you see why the turn of this symbolism would be perfect when we speak of the lotus, especially when we speak of the highest center, because unlike the other centers which open forward, or they have an equivalent behind, the one above opens upward. So it becomes literally from the root, rising up and perfectly opening above, and it's the lotus. Very suggestive when seen in a clairvoyant sight, but profoundly symbolic when you look at the symbolism and the physical characteristics of the lotus itself. So the highest organized center of our embodied being and of its action in the body is the supreme mental center figured by the yogic symbol of the thousand-petal lotus, Sahasradala. Next comes, so what about this center, which is at the top? Well, I don't feel it. I have nothing organized around it. But even if I were to feel it, what would happen? And then he says, and it is at its top and summit that there is the direct communication with the supramental levels. So it's not even in the Sahasradala. Your Sahasradala, thousand-petal lotus could open, let's say, and you still would not have the direct communication with the supramental levels. This will explain why so many people who have had the Kundalini awakening, with all their centers open, with the Kundalini fully risen, may not have at all those experiences of still higher ranges of consciousness. They may exercise powers, sometimes still living in a mental state, but having access to powers, sometimes having perceptions of the subtle sight or some kind of intuition, reflected, diluted, mixed, because the machinery of receptive consciousness is not purified, has not been developed. You have not gone through this particular training program Sri Aurobindo is giving to you, but you just have access to something which then becomes heavily mixed, distorted, etc. So just to make this point a little more seriously, last time there was a question from one of the viewers about choosing the path of Kundalini or Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. This is the big difference. With the Kundalini yoga, you might have the Kundalini and even the chakras awakened, and still you would not be capable of a higher grade of consciousness or living by a higher grade of consciousness. You would still be largely vulnerable, destabilized, unstable, unable to handle the intensities that come from the opened chakras or the active Kundalini, etc. And it is the case even in the fact of spiritual beings in whom the Kundalini was highly intensely active, that they were unstable, difficult to contain that kind of energetic awakening, and it creates a lot of problems for all of them. And I know of several, some which are less painful, but still unstable with some kind. And despite all that, no access to higher ranges of consciousness beyond the mind. Why and where does that come? And this is the key point here. At the top and summit of this center. So it's not enough that the center opens. You have to then find what is its top and summit. There you will find direct communication with supramental levels. He's not speaking of the supermind. Supramental means all ranges above mental, which would begin with, and if you follow Sri Aurobindo's categorization, higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive mind, overmind, and then the supermind proper. And even if for some reason, let's say just at that point, you got the higher mind, oh wow, that's wonderful. It is so overwhelming, so wonderful that you'll say, this is it. No, it's just the first of each grade, 5 of them being so radically greater as to turn the previous one to be almost just the preliminary of what follows. So you get here an idea of why this whole experience of higher ranges of consciousness are not found even among those who have had the best of the Kundalini Yoga experiences or various other traditional forms of practices or experience. So what would it mean for us then from a practice point of view? We will of course look at the text that follows where he will explain what needs to be done. But the key idea here will be first, this center, which is top of the head in the subtle body, above the intellect now, above the center of the intellect, needs to become conscious, needs to become more awake and organized. That is, the consciousness there would become now coherent, stable as a focal point. And from there, the lower working, including of thought and reason, will get organized around this. And then from that poise, it's as if you will turn to its highest available. So understand, even within that, just as in the intellect, there are degrees of development of the intellect. So a teenager who's just discovering his capacity to think independently of emotions and to be able to argue out, and even gets great joy in arguing on trivial things, will say, oh, I am so great, I'm able to argue out, I'm so smart. But when he meets somebody who's able to clearly state with precision and large structures, he'll say, wow, what kind of power of intellect is that? And then let's say he develops to that gradation, and then he sees a power of mind still greater and says, my God, how far can this go? Within the intelligence, there are ranges, and those would still be within this domain of, let's say, forehead center. And so what we are doing in the opening to the Sahasradala is the 1,000-petal lotus is now something still higher, and within that are gradations. And the highest, it is at its top and summit. Why the distinction top and summit? And top is more a physical location. Summit is the grade of consciousness available in that physical location. So literally you will take your consciousness, raise it to the highest, and he will tell you how to shift the center of thought itself. And then within that, it's as if you will turn up and then find yourself lifted to the highest within that. To a point where you will be on the limit, it feels as if you can't go further. Or if you go further, it will no more be mind. It will not be reasoning mind or rational mind. But already by that time, it has become so rarefied as to be almost pure abstraction of reason and mind, of intellect would be the right word, not so much reason. So pure abstraction of intellect, and then it feels as if your mind itself ceases to be. It's so fine. Is there something more? No. You've reached as if the peak limit of it. So that would be the summit of the top and summit. That there is the direct communication with the supramental levels. There you will turn up and say, I feel something above. That would be supramental as an adjective, not as a noun. So anything above mental is supramental. Supra-mental, I will put it. It's not the supermind. The supermind is that consciousness of oneness in which you have infinity and so on. We have discussed before. So from here, in the supramental ranges, you will have gradations which approach you towards that. So you get an idea of where this is, what this really means in terms of the possibilities of experience as well as the sadhana. So if this is the case now, the highest organized center of our embodied being and its action, and then from there you open to this, you have possibility of direct communication with the supramental levels. Since there it's possible, but it's not possible from the heart center. It's not possible even from the psychic influence. There's a very interesting observation the mother makes. She says when you're fully centered in the psychic presence, with no mixture of anything else at that point, it is possible from there to have a glimpse of the supermind. Because that alone can perceive it directly. And a glimpse means, you must understand, you can see it, you can see that it exists, you can feel it, you can't live in it. But at least you know and you can see. But anything before that, you will find not possible. It's too much stuck in the finite. The psychic being is still finite, and yet it's able to perceive that because of the purity of substance which corresponds to the supramental. There's a connection there. So, that's where you can have a direct communication from that above point or actually from the deepest inner. So this relates to our discussion last time of the second method. While the whole focus there was the psychic discrimination coming forward, nevertheless, from there you can have a glimpse of that, and therefore it would prepare you for this particular ascent if that influence is strong enough, or if actually you have gone to the point of coming in more and more direct contact with the psychic presence. So you see there's a natural sequence from method 1, method 2, method 3, but in principle you could begin with method 3 also just directly. So since from here you have a possibility of direct communication, it is then possible to adopt a different and a more direct method, a more direct than from inside. Not to refer all our thought and action to the Lord's secret in the heart lotus, but to the veiled truth of the divinity above the mind, and to receive all by a sort of descent from above, a descent of which we become not only spiritually but physically conscious. Now again, it's one of those sentences which has so much packed in, and we will try to unpack as much as we can here. First, he says it is possible to adopt a different and more direct method. The suggestion is that it's a possibility, and it's not that it happens automatically. You will have to make a special effort. So as we saw with the other methods also, just if you follow that as a technique, it will not necessarily take you to intuition. You have to bring in that factor which we have highlighted for each of the earlier methods, which opens it to intuition. Otherwise, just that as a technique is insufficient. So here again, the same thing. There is something you will have to do. It will not be just enough to shift your center of thought and place it above head. So it is possible to adopt a different and more direct method. So where earlier you were referring all thought and action to the Lord's secret in the heart lotus, here you refer to the veiled truth of divinity above the mind. So veiled truth above the mind, that means there is a veil there. So Sri Aurobindo uses this vocabulary in his letters where he speaks of the inner hidden behind a veil and the higher separated by a lid. So it's as if there is a lid preventing you from perceiving or directly experiencing what is above. So the veiled truth of the divinity above the mind. It's not above head, it's above mind. That's going to be a critical distinction. You can't just place your hand above and say, am I touching it? You can't just shift your center of thought above and say, now I am in a supra-mental. No, it's not. You might still be in a mental, shifted in focal point. It will be useful, but it will not be enough. You could, for example, shift your thinking center to the chest or even the abdomen. You must have read Mother's description. When she was in Japan, she was with a particular person. He had a very large stomach. And he used to say, all great people and all powerful people, they have large tummies. Why? Because that's the center of your vitality. And he would teach you to shift your center of thought from head to the stomach. And mother refers to that and she says it's very useful. It frees you from headaches. So I'm going to suggest that you try it out. I did. It must have been in my 14, 15. At that time, I had some issues with migraine. And after I read this, I said, okay, I should be able to do this. And I consciously did the shifting. And yes, during the time the center of thought had shifted to abdomen, there was no headache. And I said, oh, it works. And the thought center popped back. And I said, the headache has come back. So it took a while to be able to make that shift. But if you could shift down into abdomen, why can't you shift up above head? Yes, you can. Not a big deal. But if you did that alone, it would not open you to higher center of consciousness. So understand the key here is above the mind. So you should be able to feel the mind zone and feel the zone above mind. How will you do that? And he will teach you. And to receive all that has to come from the intuition. So all knowledge, by a sort of descent from above, a descent of which we become not only spiritually but physically conscious. So why is he saying by a sort of descent from above? And what does it mean to be spiritually conscious and physically conscious of a descent? So these are all significant in terms of our practice. So what is this sort of descent from above? Remember, eventually, all divine consciousness is everywhere. The self is everywhere. You can't say the self is 3 inches above the head. It doesn't work. If you turn your body upside down, would the self be above the feet? No, it's not a physical location. So the only reason why we have the sense of higher above head is because of this mapping in the subtle body, where the corresponding center which feels that higher grade is focal point, has a focal point or is organized in that location in the subtle body, not in the gross body. So you've already, after the Sahasradhala, you've stepped out of the gross body. So where is the center? It's in the subtle body. Your subtle body is larger than your gross body. But your subtle body is still a mental body. It is not a supramental body. So you still have a center in the mental consciousness. So, sort of descent from above, because that thing is not above in a location. It is all around. It is all inside. It is everywhere. But when it enters you, it first registers in your finest grade, which is most sensitive, which happens to be this region above head, let's say. And then from there, it registers into the next most sensitive, which happens to be generally inside the head. And then from there, it may register in the next most sensitive, which may just happen to be in the region inside, deep inside, where a strong psychic influence is present behind the emotions, or maybe directly in the psychic. So in the experience of sensitivities and receptivities, there is a kind of a top-down natural sequence. That when actually the thing happens, you feel, oh, it descends. But where was it? It was always here. So you can't say Sachidananda is above, so it cannot be below. It's not in my hand. It has to go above the head. So you look for a physical location. It's right here. Everything is Sachidananda. Everything is Supermind. Everything, even in your subtle body, everything is mind. Embedded and penetrating your physical consciousness. It's just that the focal point where your mind is plugging into the biology is largely centered in the brain and then the rest of the nervous system and with other few focal points. So the sense of the descent is the consequence of the fact that we are more sensitive in the higher ranges and less as we go down. So immediately that such an experience comes, it starts being felt there, and then like this in a series, in a sequence that then can be called a descent. So that's the idea of a sort of descent. Nothing descended. It was always there. You could even say it came forward from being hidden behind. One way of describing it. But we reserve the vocabulary of coming forward to describe that which comes from the center within of a grade of consciousness or of our being. So from there we reserve the vocabulary of coming forward so as not to confuse the descent from the coming forward. So the psychic comes forward, the spiritual descends. That's how you would use the vocabulary. A descent of which we become not only spiritually but physically conscious. So physically conscious now makes sense because the registering part are more sensitive above, less sensitive as you go down. And so the sensation is one of a descent. Very often, for those of you who have done the descent of peace practice, which I would highly recommend also for this purpose, you will often experience a dense peace. And then when it settles, it has a certain intense denseness. For some, it is first felt in the head, upper part of the head. For many, it comes up to the shoulders, and then there's a dimming of the descent. For some, it comes up to the chest, and then it becomes thin again. But if you consciously extend very quickly, you will find the same density can go all the way down to the feet. And you must do that. Sri Aurobindo specifically asks you to do that. Why? Because when you bring it down, the ranges which are less sensitive, where you feel it thinner because it is less sensitive, are as if taught to receive the dense presence and become sensitive to it by infusion. The presence filling them awakens in them the capacity to perceive the presence. So by a repeated series of conscious descent, you are making the rest of your awareness and their gradations able to perceive and receive more easily. So this would correspond to the physically conscious, but you have to become also spiritually conscious. That is, you will feel now in the subtle gradations themselves, the distinctions of those gradations. So both of these need to be done. Both will be the consequence of what we will follow subsequently in the form of the practice. But these distinctions being understood once, you will find everything else becomes clear. Without these distinctions, you can shift your center of thought above head, think all you want from there, and nothing might change, and nothing might open you to higher consciousness, or it might, but you wouldn't know why or how it happened. So you see how important these lines are in the context. Then he says, when you start doing this, obviously there'll be degrees. The siddhi, or full accomplishment, siddhi literally you could translate as perfection or attainment. So the siddhi or full accomplishment of this movement can only come when we are able to lift the center of thought and conscious action above the physical brain and feel it going on in the subtle body. So your thinking center you will shift and place above the physical brain. Where? Doesn't matter too much. It has to be above the physical space of the brain. So generally it's just above the head. So you stop touching the physical head, you go like a centimeter above, somewhere. Don't worry about where. But literally shift the center of awareness here, and you're here now. And then now train yourself to think from here. Not only that, the center of thought, the center of conscious action also. So from here, you want to do something, you initiate the action from this. Right now you're initiating from here. I'm thinking, I want to do, okay, I do. I shift up, I'm thinking, I want to do, from here I do. So until you actually do it, it won't make too much sense. When you start shifting this, you'll say, yes, that makes sense. I can feel the difference it makes when it works. And then above the physical brain and feel it going on in the subtle body. So you'll actually feel you're living in the subtle body and not in the gross body. You're there. So one of the practices which you will find, I think it is hinted at in the descent of peace meditation, is after you have had this very dense descent where you feel your subtle physical body, you put yourself more in the subtle physical than in the gross and train yourself to feel there, stay in that more and more. As that becomes easy for you and the two bodies are simultaneously aware, are simultaneously conscious in your awareness, you'll find it easy to maintain the thought itself in the subtle body than in the physical. Its immediate consequence, you will find in Sri Aurobindo's letters where he discusses this, he says, if you shift the center of thought outside the physical brain, immediate consequence is you have no more brain fatigue. What does that mean? You'll see children when they're working for exams, they're preparing for exams, they spend hours and hours and hours until the brain is as if overloaded. I can't think anymore. I'm tired. I'm exhausted in the brain. I'm unable to think. That's brain fatigue. You shift up, you're free of brain fatigue. You can continue as long as you want. The thought then becomes also finer, freer, clearer, wider, easier, more supple, more fluid, flowing. These are comments to Aurobindo. I'm using my vocabulary now, but there's a comment to Aurobindo makes in the letters. And you have no more brain fatigue, but your thinking itself becomes more free and plastic, clear, easy, effortless. The difference is huge when you actually do it. I remember once I used to have this, I did not know at that time I was deficient in many vitamins. And so I had always the sense as if I'm dragging my body and the mind is dragging. I want to do so much. I'm thinking and I can't execute because my body is too heavy. I'm dragging it. I remember once after lunch, I was sitting, I was really tired and I needed to go and nap. And I had a friend who had come for some work and he needed something from me to be written. The whole work was stuck because he needed that writing. So I told him, listen, right now I can't. I'm really tired. I've just had my food and I need to have my nap. But we just had a discussion about this. And he said, but can't you just shift your level above head? Yes. That takes effort. So I was lazy. I said, okay. So I shifted at that point. The moment it came up, I still remember what it was like. You shift up and pop, oof, and it's free. None of the heaviness of the biology, none of the heaviness of the brain fatigue, biology fatigue, low vitamin fatigue, or whatever that issue is. And I was clear, free here. And the text which was required for him, I just dictated like that. He made the notes. It was done. And then I let the thing fall back and again the heaviness. It's that distinct. And you'll realize you can actually shift there and stay there. Initially, you'll tend to fall back like this. When that happened, I couldn't stay up on my own for too long. The body was too tired. It needed effort. But when you do this reasonably frequently, there comes a time where the ease with which you're able to stay there grows. But the key is when you actually feel it happening in your subtle body. So as long as you're living in the gross body, you shift your thought center above head, you will tend to fall back because you live in the gross body. When you shift your base of consciousness into the subtle body, let's say the subtle physical to begin with, then you can shift there and stay there effortlessly because you're living in that grade of consciousness. That's your key. So you see, in this one sentence, what he has conveyed to you without all this elaboration, it's there, all this is actually explained to you. It's implicit, it's obvious once you understand it. So after I've said this, you read the text, you'll say, yes, of course, that's what it is. So the siddhi, reread, the siddhi or full accomplishment of this movement can only come when we are able to lift the center of thought and conscious action above the physical brain and feel it going on in the subtle body. So to feel it going on in the subtle body is required for the full accomplishment and siddhi of this operation. If to feel it happening in the subtle body means you should be conscious in the subtle body and you should be able to live in the subtle body, at least at the same time or separately, whatever. So if we can feel ourselves thinking no longer with the brain, but from above and outside the head in the subtle body, that is a sure physical sign of a release from the limitations of the physical mind. So when you feel yourself thinking no longer with the brain, but from above and outside the head in the subtle body, where do you feel you're thinking? I'm thinking. I'm thinking. My head is aching from thinking. Shift now. No longer in the brain, above and outside the head in the subtle body. So become conscious more and more of the subtle body. Place yourself more and more in this region of the subtle body above head. And let your thinking process itself more and more settle there. In practice, the effect will be as if you will feel more of you above than below. And the tendency to see through physical sight is all that will tend to pull you down, because to see through physical sight, it's as if the center of your awareness needs to fall to the level of the eyes. That's the only remnant. And when you actually shift and stabilize there fully, you will not have a problem, because you're looking from here, but you're still based above. The separation is a little bit like when you say, I'm feeling in the chest, but I don't have to bring my thought into the chest to feel from the chest. I'm thinking here, but I'm feeling there. In the same way, you'll feel above head and see from here. And you will feel this seeing is an inferior seeing. The physical sight is an inferior sight. There is a clearer mental sight. I will use the word freed mental sight belonging to this freed grade of mind, which will see there with the mental perception, and the two will overlay. And this can easily become, if you so choose, the starting point also of a subtle perception or an intuitive perception and so on. But for the moment, you see, it's also forcing you the separation of physical sight and the recognition of limitation of physical sight. So if we feel ourselves thinking no longer with the brain, not in the brain, with the brain, right now you feel you need the brain to think. There you'll find, I don't need the brain to think. The brain is just there. It's at best an organ through which my thought flows into biology for biological action or expression. And outside the head, in the subtle body. That is a sure physical sign of a release from the limitations of the physical mind. The physical mind is precisely the mind embedded in the biology, and so dependent on the brain. And with that comes this thing which says, is all this true? Is the divine presence real? What will the divine think? Will the divine respond to me? All these very stupid ideas, they're also irrational. Because the divine is everywhere. The divine doesn't need two eyes to see or two hands to act. But that kind of thinking happens when you get reduced into the biological existence, and that's all the real for you, that you feel you're born with it and die with the biology. That's all it feels like. The moment you shift here, you don't feel that. You already experience the immortality natural to mind consciousness, which is very different from the psychic sense of immortality. In the psychic sense of immortality, you feel the sense of eternity. You feel yourself immortal. Here, death has no meaning because you're free. You don't have a beginning or end, that's all. But you don't experience the sense of eternity or immortality as in the psychic. But obviously from here, the sense of that freedom is already a starting point from which you can easily open to the sense of the infinite or the eternal and so on. So this is a sure physical sign of a release from the limitations of the physical mind. And he continues, this is not yet finished, very important. And though this will not be complete at once, nor of itself bring the supramental action, for the subtle body is mental and not supramental. Still, it is a subtle and pure mentality and makes an easier communication with the supramental centers. So again, we come to this point. This alone will not give you the supramental. First, he says it will not be complete at once. Okay, so in the beginning, you'll oscillate or you'll have a partial shift or even a double awareness. Nor of itself brings supramental action. Why? Because the subtle body in which you are is itself mental, not supramental. Still, it is a subtle and pure mentality and makes an easier communication with the supramental centers. So you've got to a grade of pure mentality and a subtle mentality. From here then to perceive ranges above becomes easier. So as an exercise, what it could be, what would help, and you will find this again implicit in the descent of peace exercise. As you open to the peace above head, you can stay aware of it. In the beginning, you're as if below, turning up. Later, you'll find yourself pulled up and absorbed in the above head consciousness and the sense of infinity of it. Stay there. And then with it, you will descend with the peace. But that above head poise, frequently experienced, staying in it, familiarizing yourself with it, will prepare you for this. First, it will create this grade of the pure mentality or subtle mentality and pure mentality. In that grade, the perception what is above and beyond becomes easy. When this has been sufficiently developed, and often when it has been infused with the peace and light from above, you will feel in it a certain clarity and familiarity to things beyond. So it's always the higher which will prepare the lower for perception of the higher. But in this grade, that can happen. If you try to do the same thing while you're embedded inside the head consciousness, the dulling effect of the head consciousness at best might give you occasional glimpses, but you won't know why it doesn't go more or why it does not happen more often. When it's stayed graded above and settled there, from here, and once it has become familiar, you can open almost at will and perceive, that which is beyond. Because this has been prepared. Even if it has not been prepared the first time, a little bit of effort may be needed to have a partial perception. But when there have been series of descents in this above head grade, then from there you will be able to develop familiarity and be able to open to that consciously at will eventually. So it is a subtle and pure mentality and makes an easier communication with the supramental centers. Now he explains what happens, because you have not yet got to that, but from this poise something has been got. What happens with the rest of it? Will there be a mixture? The lower movements must still come. But it is then found easier to arrive at a swift and subtle discrimination, telling us at once the difference, distinguishing the intuitional thought from the lower intellectual mixture, separating it from its mental coatings, rejecting the mere rapidities of the mind which imitate the form of the intuition without being of its true substance. So once you have this, the mixtures will be there, but you will be able to make out what is mixed. And then he describes all the various kinds of mixture. So swift and subtle discrimination telling us the difference. So the discrimination sometimes takes time. Sometimes the discrimination is easy when there is a coarse mixture, but not easy when there is a subtle mixture. But when you are here, you'll find it will be swift and subtle in the discrimination. So that's a huge relief already and enormously accelerates the further development. Telling us at once the difference between the higher and lower mixtures. Distinguishing intuitional thought from lower intellectual mixture. Remember, intuition will still descend. It will get mixed with the lower, but you'll be able to make out which is which. Separating it from its mental coatings. So as the intuitive insight comes, you'll have the mental forms into which it will get trapped. You'll be able to say, yes, this is the form, that is the essence, and you can drop and shed the form. It becomes easy when you're able to distinguish. So this distinguishing, remember, when you're dealing with intuition, it's not merely in terms of ideas, it's in terms of substance. So we'll come to that part. That's one of the most important things. Separating from mental coatings, rejecting the mere rapidities of the mind which imitate the form of the intuition. So somebody has an intuition, I got it. Somebody else rapidly jumps, I got it. Both may say, I got it at the same moment, but there's a fundamental difference. One went through process of mind rapidly, the other perceived directly without needing process. That would be more the true intuition. So very often you will see a genius, which is true intuition ultimately, as distinct from someone who has a rapid thought, a rapid mind, clear, free rapidities. There's a difference. This one can only go so far because it does not have true insight. It cannot cut through deceptive appearances. It cannot leap beyond limited datas. Whereas the true intuition will cut through deceptive appearance and leap far beyond and say, I got that. And then find a way to articulate or make the bridge between what is known and what needs to be explained. So the rapidity of mind is not, it's an imitation of the form of intuition, but is not it. So what is the difference if you imitate the form? What is the difference when it's not it? Without being of its true substance. Now comes a very important idea. Every grade of consciousness is grade of substance of consciousness. Consciousness is not mere abstraction, it is substantial. So if you've experienced the descent of the peace, you've experienced it as a dense substance that fills you. And then if you've had various kinds of experiences, and if you've done it frequently enough, there are times when you feel this very dense peace descending, and sometimes it is a very light, clear, free peace descending. You experience gradations in difference of what descends. That's when you begin to understand what Sri Aurobindo means by substance. When actually these experiences grow, you will find what descends from above as an intuition has a substance which is so different from your mind substance that it's obvious. And literally you feel the kernel, which is intuition, and the coating, which is mind substance. And the substance feels so different, you can just shed that by refusing it, rejecting it. So, but at that point, your mind has already got somewhat intuitivized. You're no more dependent on thought. You're distinguishing substantiality of grade of consciousness in which the thought or mind activity takes place. So a transition has been made already by familiarity, where the thing from above and the thing from below, even though they seem to mix like oil and water, will feel so different that you can easily separate them and just shed the other. And this is the key. He says this, although the lower movements will be there, you'll be able to easily separate like this because of the difference of substance. Then he says, it will be easier to discern rapidly the higher planes of the true supramental being and call down their power to effect the desired transformation and to refer all the lower action to the superior power and light that it may reject and eliminate, purify and transform, and select among them its right material for the truth that has to be organized within. So now he is taking this a further step. So far we were discussing mixtures of intuition, but the same process will take you further ranges. Remember, they're all supramental as an adjective, so ranges above. So in time, still higher gradations of consciousness as they come, then you'll be able to distinguish those from this mix. And among those, you'll be able to distinguish gradations. And you'll be able to call down their power to effect the desired transformation. So you'll be able to literally focus on a particular grade and call that down. Let me take an analogy which is more accessible. You feel emotions, they're sticky, they tend to be turbid, they tend to be confusing, and they are non-transparent. One emotion covers another emotion. Feel thought, clear, simple, direct. You can have two thoughts, but you're aware of the two thoughts and their relationship. Even if one seems to cover another, you see one through the other. Observe it in this way, you'll see, yes, of course it is like that. Emotions can get layered, and the stronger emotion on the surface will cover the other or blur out or blend into the other. In thought, you're able to hold the distinction between two thoughts, even though they seem one includes the other. Notice the quality of substance in which it takes place. When you're familiar with this, let's say a strong emotional thought rises. So I'm upset. I really don't want to have anything to do with this person. Okay, this has come up. It's my thought, it's my decision. Observe, and the grade is of the lower grade of substance. And now shift to a freer, higher grade of substance. You shift layer, literally shift, and you look at as if from above the same thing and say, doesn't make sense. What's the right thing? And you can actually make a decision which comes from a higher, freer consciousness. This is the right thing to do. You may still have both. This part which is, I don't want. But the right thing is this. You can choose. But you feel the grade, substance is totally different. Now, once you've got used to this distinction, you can consciously shift to the higher grade substance. Here I have, let's say, a whole confusing range of phenomena in my surface consciousness. I say, what do I want to do? Let me take my highest poise. Shoop, I shift up. Pick whatever highest available now. And then infuse the higher clarity into the lower. Okay, so I calm down this thing, relax, and bring clarity, light and calm the emotions. Why? Because you could tap into the higher grade by familiarity and by distinction, and now you can infuse it into the lower. Exactly the same thing happens in the above head ranges. So you will experience in time, let's say this process continues, you'll experience gradations. Just as in the descent of the piece, you would have experienced different gradations of density of the piece, or the clarity of the piece, or luminosity of the piece, and so on. And then you can consciously choose and align with a particular one now that you've become familiar with it, and center yourself in it. And then invoke that. So you discern and call down their power to effect the desired transformation. Infuse it into the lower, and or the reverse, from below, refer all the lower action to the superior power and light, that it may reject and eliminate, purify and transform. So two things: you can tap into the higher, infuse into the lower, or from the lower you open and call, relate to, refer to the higher. And what will happen then in that interaction? The higher will reject and eliminate, purify and transform, and select among them its right material for the truth that has to be organized within us. So if you observe all these things which happens, so the higher, when it enters or influences the lower, it will reject things, it will eliminate certain tendencies, and then it will purify other tendencies, and then it will generally in time tend to transform. And as this process continues, it will select the material that's required for what it wants to express. So as the thing comes, it will gather together the right words, the right ideas, the right memories even. Sometimes it will happen something you had read long, long ago, 20, 30 years ago, which you've forgotten you had read, is drawn out by the higher and brought in forward as a vivid memory, and say, oh yeah, I'd forgotten that, but it's such a perfect thing now needed. If you're writing poetry, it will draw words that you had forgotten you had known the meaning of. And then you will know at that moment not only the meaning, you will know how perfectly it fits into the line at that moment. So that's what he means by select among them, among the lower. It's the right material for the truth that has to be organized within us. So the lower and the higher now, the distinction between them, the ability to tap into the higher, the ability to turn the lower to the higher, this is going to be your key by which now the higher begins to work in and through the lower by these means. Reject things which cannot be changed, eliminate things which have to be removed, tendencies in this case. So reject parts, eliminate tendencies, purify, that is, liberate from its habitual tendencies and make it responsive to the higher by bringing stillness and familiarity with the higher grade, and transform, that is by infusion, the material itself undergoes a change, and then select the right material for the truth that has to be organized within us. Again, we come to the word organized. So now comes a very important idea, which he will elaborate in the next sentence using the word reformation of our whole consciousness in terms of the higher. But this is what is meant by organize. The higher will take the lower, begins to restructure these, build a focal point through which it can work with material, substance, gradations, new rhythms, habits, tendencies, organized through which now, when it decides to act, this higher grade can flow through seamlessly all the way down. So your power of intellectual reasoning, which is now, let's say, forehead region inside, opens to something higher still. Maybe that opens to something higher, doesn't matter. And from the higher, when the intuition comes, it will use your reasoning power, which you had trained hopefully before, for exercising itself to articulate, to clarify, to justify, or to perfectly state in and structure. The best example you have is right now the text we are reading, or other writings of Sri Aurobindo, such as in the Life Divine, where with very clear logic, clarity, structure of reason and intellect, a brilliant intellect, he structures an experience which is way above and so complex and difficult to have articulated. And if you see the kind of thing, the way we are studying, it's as if you had to explain the same thing with your current intellect, you would need 10, 20 sentences. And he manages to compress it all in a single sentence. Of course, the sentence becomes a little complex, rich in structure, and multifaceted, but the condensation is enormous. It's a 10 sentences compressed into one. It's a huge compression. If you look at the printed volume of the Life Divine being something like this, 2-3 inches thick, depending on paper thickness, imagine if it was tenfold, and that's just one book. So the compression has great value for other reasons also, because it actually shapes in you the way the higher faculty thinks. So coming back to the point, the intellect which was leading your life now becomes now the tool and vehicle for the higher intuition, which uses it as a power of expression, which is its proper role. This is a point Sri Aurobindo makes. Currently, we have not developed the higher grade of knowledge. Therefore, we use intellect for knowledge seeking. But by itself, it is unable to seek true knowledge. It can never prove something true or false. It does not have the means to know what is true. It has only the power to articulate a truth once known. Since itself cannot find truth, if you go purely by intellect, you'll find yourself become agnostic, because you can prove anything, disprove anything. What's true? I don't know. I can never be sure. Good example is people like U.G. Krishnamurti, if you have read some of his stuff, philosophy. J. Krishnamurti, who was like a minor modified version of that, at least he spoke of possibility of finding truth. U.G. says there is no truth because it doesn't exist. It cannot be found because it doesn't exist, because he's in pure agnostic grade of mind-driven pursuit. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo says, mind has to accept a truth which it can never prove. So either it accepts a higher truth or a lower truth. Lower truth would be your desire, impulse, emotional, or other needs, sensory needs, and then mind is now dedicated to fulfilling that. Or a higher intuition or the soul's perception that says, yes, this truth, this divine presence, the realization of that, the deepening of contact with that, this is what I want. And then the intellect moves into articulate, justify, or express. Itself cannot know. It can only articulate. So what happens naturally? The higher faculty is now growing in us. Organize the lower in their terms. Where earlier intellect was your means of knowing, now it becomes merely a means of expression. The means of knowing is the higher intuition, which itself now has to organize under influence of something still higher, and so on. So the higher descending organizes the right material for the truth that has to be organized within us. And here you get the organization process itself, where earlier your organization of emotions or mind were done largely by your effort and experiences and compulsions of life. Now it is a higher truth descending which organizes. The result is what would have been many lifetimes work of slow, laborious development can be done within weeks, months, at most a year. That's the kind of rapidity when the higher infuses into the lower and organizes it in its terms. Your evolution itself is enormously accelerated. By conventional means of evolution, looking at the past, what would take 1,000,000 years literally is done within a couple of years. This opening up of the higher, this opening up of a higher level and of higher and higher planes of it, and the consequent reformation of our whole consciousness and its action into their mold and into the substance of their power and luminous capacity is found in practice to be the greater part of the natural method used by the divine Shakti. So you are connecting this now to the first two Chatushtayas, the second Chatushtaya being the working of the divine Shakti within you and filling you. So increasingly, remember, for the 4 methods, he had said, well, work on all 4, do not attach to one particular, let the Shakti use whichever is easier in the way she chooses. So in practice, he says this particular process, which we will again review, is what the Shakti tends to do, and it's a natural process of the Shakti. In fact, that's how the most rapid way of growth of intuition and higher ranges all the way to the supermind will happen. So, opening up of a higher level and of higher and higher planes of it. So, first you realize above head, wow, there's a whole range. Let's say one big chunk. And within that, higher and higher planes of it. So, super mind, beyond mind, okay? And then higher and higher planes within that. Now, how you name it is irrelevant here. For this purpose, we don't care. Just recognize their gradations. First the opening up, and then higher and higher gradations of it open up to you. And the consequent reformation of our whole consciousness and its action into their mold. So each time something opens up of a higher grade, it reforms the whole consciousness and the whole of its action. So there are two things always he's saying: the grade of consciousness, your awareness changes, and the way it acts and the way the action plugs into the rest of you is rebuilt. Ideally, all the way down to the most physical part. So for example, let's say your fingers have been largely mentalized. You're playing a musical instrument because the finger have been mentalized enough that you read a notation of musical notes and your fingers know what they need to do. That's mentalized fingers, okay, or mentalized movements in fingers tuned in to a particular pattern of notes. You read and your finger moves. You don't have to say, oh, this note's missed that finger, I have to push it. It's automatic. That's mentalized link of that movement with those ideas or that image. Okay. So mentalization of finger, for example, in this case, a higher grade of mind from an abstract idea and can flow into the finger. How complex can this be? Literally, your hand can write or type rapidly. You're doing it. It's not automatic writing. You're doing it, but it's flowing from what you know and the words form. So if you've ever written a poem which was inspired, you know what it feels like. Literally, the words form within you and you know they're being drawn out from you by that higher working in you. You're doing it, and you're just not you doing it, it's that doing it in you, using your material. But it's not automatic writing. You're not unconscious, you're a participant. And you can, at that point, choose to swing this way or that way, or modify, or stop, or activate. So what happens is the higher now changes consciousness and the action of consciousness, ideally all the way to the physical. Each time there's a higher gradation, it must change all the way and penetrate to the physical, into their mold. The receiving lower grade is the mold into which that higher now forms. And now come the two critical terms: into the substance of their power and luminous capacity. So molding the lower into the substance of their power and their luminous capacity. So remember, substance we've spoken of, literally you feel it is a different grade, but also luminous capacity. Each higher grade has also greater clarity, transparency, awareness, which increasingly is experienced as luminosity and light. And the capacity is now freer, wider, larger, richer. So as the grade of substance infuses, this higher luminosity and capacity increases and reforms the whole of the lower consciousness and its action each time by that. This is the method in practice of the natural working of the Shakti in us. Now, if you understand that this is what the divine Shakti will do in you, this is also how you can consciously align and participate in the process of the sadhana. So I won't go into this further because I think the idea is sufficiently gained and the sense of how what it feels like can be felt. Let it start happening. As it starts happening, when you reread this text and maybe the commentary with it, you'll say, yes, now it begins to make more sense. Oh yeah, that's how it feels like. Oh my God, this is so interesting. And now that I can feel it happening in this grade, I know that this is how it will happen in further grades, though I don't know those grades yet. And you can allow yourself, literally give yourself more and more interest in the working of Shakti. And when she works in you, you will feel what she's doing and how she's doing. That's when the sadhana is enormously accelerated. That's when you will literally experience hundreds of years just compressed, sometimes in a few days or weeks. This is what you see in Sri Aurobindo's notes in the record of yoga. you see that kind of pace, and you see the kind of pace building up as the process develops. So in the first 2 years in the record of yoga, since that's our current study really, you'll find many gradations of experiences and then occasional relapses or mixtures, and he is doing what needs to be done for correction. But after the first 2 years, you find a sudden acceleration. And by the fourth year already, he's having experiences of the supramental consciousness. And still, of course, gradations within that. And more, he begins to drop the lower type of experiences, but also those problems cease to happen. Where earlier there were relapses and mixtures of certain kinds, those don't happen. Now there's a different kind of shift, if any, and they become less and less also, because the freer and clearer working of the higher force is now dominating. And so it has less relapses also. So here is then, in summary, the third method, which you begin by first shifting the center of thought above head, centering it more and more in the subtle body. Having come to that, and if you have done the first two, from there, you can open to the awareness of a higher range of consciousness, which is felt then easily, because this grade is able to do that. And once you feel that, you're able to feel this higher grade descending into you and reshaping, recasting, reorganizing your current processes. The fourth method we will take up next time, and don't know if we will complete the whole chapter itself. I will decide after. I don't want to anticipate. But this is important to understand and very accessible in form of practice. The moment you start doing, all the rest of it becomes now more and more spontaneously accessible, both as experience and familiar. There are questions in the chat box from last time also, and let me just go through quickly. Interesting. Jessica says, my friend's aunt was born blind. She asked her what she dreams when asleep. She responded by drawing wavy lines and patterns and spiral shapes. Interesting. Soumya is asking, can you please suggest the title of Ingo Swan's book on clairvoyance? So he himself has several books. I think you will find them. I think most of them have been reprinted recently. Take a look. Many of them are also available in PDF forms if you go to some of these what are called free libraries. I don't recommend that from an ethical point of view, but if you can't afford to buy, many of these are very expensive. If you can't afford to buy, do what you can. But he himself would probably not mind anymore. But under his name, you'll find the full list of books. But what I was referring to was Ingo Swan suggesting certain books on clairvoyance. Unfortunately, right now, I don't remember exactly. One of them, I think, is called Healing Hands, and he named the particular clairvoyant that he found to have the best drawings. If I can, I will try to pull that up next time. But I think that was one of the books. Healing Hands or Hands of Light, something like that. Okay. Sparsh is saying, I strongly feel the top of the head, but feel high pressure in the head when I concentrate there. Yes, you will feel pressure if you just concentrate there. You will feel pressure on the forehead if you just concentrate there. Pressure in itself is not useful. What you have to do is place yourself there, relax that part and open to what is above. And feel the presence in what is above. That is useful. That is what will change and open you to the higher consciousness. So Overmind is saying that depends on the level of your highest consciousness and organization that has been established. For example, the mother's subtle physical was supramentalized, but not all are ready for that region because the mother said there's a subtle physical which has been transformed. So I don't remember at what point. This was at 8:15. You made this comment. I don't remember at what point, but this is not the point Sri Aurobindo makes. When he says become conscious in the subtle body, it's not supramentalized. It is as it is now, as you are. You don't need for it to be supramentalized to have this. In fact, by becoming conscious there and eventually becoming conscious of the higher gradations, they will fill and tend to transform this. But first, to become conscious in the subtle body is very easy. It does not take much. Again, I will suggest the descent of peace as a guided practice for this. When you experience the peace descending fully, let it overflow around, surrounding the fingers, hands, and you'll feel immediately this very dense layer around. And that's the moment you're conscious of your subtle physical grade. Because the peace filling it makes it conscious. In time, you can feel the extension of it. I do not know if it is there in I think in one of the guided processes, the full extension of it is also described. When you feel the full range of your subtle body. And once you're familiar with that, you can feel the descent of peace taking place directly in the subtle body. It's much more intense, much more powerful than even the physical. So all this is within your capacity as you are now, does not require any higher grade. Familiarize yourself to be conscious in this layer. As this grows, you will find even in daily life, for example, you can be aware of the subtle hand, the extension around. With a little bit of awareness, you'll be able to feel it. If the piece has just experienced a strong descent, you'll feel it very strong and dense. From there, extend it into work and activity. So I remember as a consequence of some of these practices, one of my friends who used to go jogging regularly, and I'd suggested, why don't you practice jogging with that? So he would shift into the subtle physical and then start jogging. And one practical result was he felt the physical body was so light. He didn't feel its weight, and he could go much greater distances without getting tired because he was in the subtle physical carrying the gross physical inside it. So these are things very easy to access. It just takes a little bit of skill. And once you get the hang of it, that's easy to do. Then shifting full awareness of your thought process itself into that layer. Shanta is asking, what about hearing from above the head? Yeah, you could do that, but to me, that's not so important. The focus is not so much on using your physical senses, but the shift of thought itself. The state where you feel my thinking itself is based here more than in the head. When that happens, automatically your physical senses, which you're still plugged into, will register in that more freed state of mind. And that's all that's required, really. Sirius is asking, my question is, do we need to go inside first to perceive this Sahasrara, or can we access through our surface mind? You don't have to go inside. You don't need to perceive the Sahasrara at all. So I said the clairvoyant side can see that. Let's say you have an emotional center. Okay, an emotional center has also a focal point of one of these chakras. Do you need to see that to feel emotions? No. Similarly, your thought center is largely in the head. Do you need to see your center? You don't. You think there. That's all. Same thing happens here. You shift your center of thought here. You don't need to be clairvoyant. You don't need to see your Sahasrara. Do not bring in needless confusions. Nowhere Sri Aurobindo says you need to see it. It's happening in that grade. That's all that matters. It's in the subtle body that the Sahasrara exists. It's not even in the physical. So all you're doing is shifting the center above head. You feel your thought here and you feel the thinking increasingly in this grade of substance which is well larger than your gross body. That's all. Subjectively, that's all that happens. You don't need clairvoyant sight. It's very simple and well within your reach. Yes, so over mind says, in the subtle physical, I find running very easy, swift. Physical feels so much better. Absolutely. It's so much lighter, freer, more comfortable, more joyous. Yes. So Revati says, I read something fantastic. The author states his experience when he was meditating in a jungle where in his vicinity jaguars were playing, yet he had no fear, only gratitude. He describes this as seeing with the heart, oneness with nature. What siddhi is this of seeing from the heart? Does it mean acting from heart center? Okay. The author is none other than our Narad. Okay. It's not a siddhi. It's the state in which the person is in the feeling of being one with nature. It need not be spiritual. It may be spiritual. I do not know what that description was, but it is what naturally happens when you live in the life energies in harmony with the forest. So there's a very simple experience one can have. You enter the forest space, you let your awareness, all awareness, mind, vital, everything, just widen out and feel the entire forest space as wide as you can, as if you're listening to all the birds, all the animals, and all the trees, and you feel them as a part of you, yourself a part of them. It can be purely life energies. It can be part of the mind mixed with life energies. It doesn't need a spiritual experience, but a oneness experience in the vital, in the mental, or a blend of these. In that, you will find this kind of experience is easy already. That the animals will naturally feel comfortable with you because they feel the oneness, you feel the oneness, there's harmony. You break out of the oneness when the animal feels you, they feel fear because you're not part of their life energy oneness. So the experience itself can be had on that level, but into that, if the person has already that awakening, something of the psychic or something of the higher spiritual may also fill in, which makes the experience more psychic or spiritual. And then the response of the animals would be also much greater. So probably in Narad's case, it would have been with a strong psychic presence in the oneness. But my point is these kinds of things you'll find very often in the shamanic traditions, where they walk into the forest, they feel one with the whole thing, but it need not have a psychic or spiritual dimension. So I think Prema Devi is saying the book's name is Barbara Ann Brennan, Hands of Light. Yes, that's the book, which Ingo Swan recommended. She has a second book. So because the drawings were done under her instructions, he found those to be the most accurate in among all that he had seen. Thank you for sharing that. Over Mind 11 is saying, my point is you said subtle physical is still only mind level. This is not true for those who have organized a higher mind or spiritual mind in their subtle physical. And yes, so the mother has supramentalized a subtle physical. Yes, that is true. But for our purpose, we are not speaking of that. That would be a consequence of what Sri Aurobindo is describing. My point was, for the purpose of this practice, where you want to open to the intuition, your subtle physical as it is good enough. It will be intuitivized and further supramentalized eventually as a consequence of this. But now when you become aware in your subtle physical, it is a grade of physical density, but it's a subtle grade into which a degree of mental awareness has now been brought in. That's all. So you're aware of it. It's no big deal. It's available and accessible to anybody with a little bit of effort. And in fact, this is what many do during training of martial arts. And they can master the subtle physical to a point where they can literally project it out of the physical as an extension, use it to push things, move things, influence things, even cut things, hit, etc. None of it requires any spiritual training. So my point is, just becoming aware of subtle physical is no big deal. You can do it now as you are. Do not focus on that though. If you say, oh, I'm waiting for my subtle physical, no. Just focus on shifting your awareness above head. Hold this poise. Feel yourself more and more in this. And if you combine it with that practice, which I discussed earlier, of the descent of peace, you will feel not only you are here, but the whole body of that grade. You'll feel like a slightly larger, swollen form around the gross physical, into which that shifting, the thinking center has shifted more and more. Do not worry if initially it falls back, or it is a double awareness. Just work on this. It's a very relaxed, very enjoyable exercise. Play with it rather than going after it with desperation. Play with it, habituate, enjoy it, and you'll find that things begin to happen quite easily. I will close with some questions which came from the same person last time, called Collective Joy, who asked the question about raising the IQ. And the questions now are, there are several. First, very often I silence my mind, concentrate above the head, and pray to the mother for intuition and wait. But the time simply passes and nothing comes. No answer during that silence or in the days after. There is emptiness every time. I go back to work with my mind normally, struggling with pieces, arranging things. So since the last session, I've silenced my mind and concentrated above head. I've asked the mother to give me a big picture and a right place of things so I can ask the right questions. But no intuition has come since last Saturday's session. It didn't come in problem solving, video editing, design work, speaking, in anything in daily life. I'm fully dependent on thinking. Maybe I should try long enough and be consistent. Maybe this is lacking. Okay, that's the question. So the response is very simple. To begin with, remember, the third method is shift the center of thought. At this point, he is not saying stop thinking. He's saying shift the center of thought, continue to think from this higher above head poise, out of brain, above brain poise, let's say. So what you're doing now, continue to do exactly that, but from this center above head. So you're thinking, you're doing problem solving, video editing, design work, speaking, shift the center above head and do it from there. Just work on this first. Easy, you can already do it. You're already doing it. Just habituate yourself to this. Then you shift yourself. Before you speak, you pause. Or before you do your problem solving, you pause. Center yourself in that. Become very quiet and still and turn to the presence above. Feel that. And then while feeling that, turn back to the problem to solve or speak and flow from there as you would normally. Except now you're feeling that which is behind, beyond, like a backdrop, like a presence. And you'll feel the substance, this keyword substance. You'll feel the substance of that filling your thought. And you'll say, oh, wow. You're still thinking, but it'll be a different, wider, freer, larger, insightful perspective, whatever form it takes. But you must quiet, feel what is above, and then flow from that initially. So you see how the methods blend. Shift center first, habituate yourself. Then shift center, quiet and feel above. And then from there, go back to your thought, but not by falling back. From the higher feel of that presence, let the thought form. So you don't it's not as if you wait. You can do that also. You wait until something pops, which can happen. But initially, if you find that's not happening, let the thinking begin from there. Initiation would be from a higher poise. And because you touched or felt the presence above and let the initiation happen from there, the substance of that, the grade of that, you will feel distinctly. Okay, so that's how you start. Well within your reach, start doing it. Okay, next question. How far can sincere pursuit truly take an average person beyond plus 20 IQ point? Are physical factors, brain structure, genetics, real ceilings, or does consciousness transcend entirely, as in Sri Aurobindo's case? If your biology genetics is basically healthy, there is no limit. If you have a major defect, which is not your case, so do not worry. But there are people who are born with some major defect. Then their ability to make that effort itself is compromised. But the same people outside the body, when they step out of the body, let's say they go out of the body in some way, will find they're very intelligent. They come back into the body and there's the dulling effect caused by the damage in the brain or nervous system. So setting aside those cases, let's focus on your case. More than plus 20 IQ increase is easy to do if you follow that framework which I described. It's not dependent on physical brain. Physical brain is only a mechanism for articulation and expression. It is not your basis for intelligence or thought, which will take place now with the method 3, outside the physical brain in any case. And you'll feel how much clearer and freer your thoughts are. And you will know at that point you don't think with your brain. It's a mistake to identify with the brain and think with the brain. You're dulling and reducing your power of thought. So again, this should have been taught. This will be taught one day as a practical training in our schools eventually. So the question also is, what about astrology? And Sri Aurobindo's chart holds vast knowledge. Yes, but the chart is only at best an indicator of a possibility that he worked on or he developed. It's never, you see, a chart, remember, is only defining tendencies in your vital nature, left to their instinctive drives. The moment you assert with your mind a certain freedom, you have gone out of the chart. The moment your soul pushes through its intention, it goes beyond chart. So let go of those ideas. They are, remember, at best lower vital instinctive tendencies, nothing more. If what you have already described you've done, you've already gone out of the chart as far as that part of your life is concerned. Okay, next question. Must one reach domain-specific competence, work out basics, before intuition flows there? Or can basic readiness, being sattvic, unclogged nadis, removing ardent hastiness, silenced mind, awaken it suddenly, even in unfamiliar areas? Whose will decides the content, ours or the divine's? It's a very important question. I'm so glad you asked this. So the question really is, if you just develop your intuition in a general way, will it automatically act in all your familiar activities? Or do you need to develop intuition first, let's say in your writing, then in your singing, then in your gymnastics or whatever? The answer generally will be both. But I'll explain why and how. When you start doing this, the effect of the intuition will be everywhere. But the impact will be most visible in the parts where your consciousness is most awakened and most attuned to your own higher parts. So let's say you've trained in music and you've already developed this higher access of some higher grade of mind when you play music. Then the intuition now developed, let's say a tiny bit, will flow or be visible most dramatically in the music than in other things, let's say speech, where you may not have tuned to your higher or deeper parts. So it's more like this, that initially there is an effect everywhere, but most visible in the parts which are most receptive, most refined, most open to the deeper and higher ranges already within you. But at the same time, you will notice it is present in casual and trivial things. There, in those less developed activities, you may need to make special effort, then it becomes domain specific. So for example, if you have developed your intuition in playing music, but not in speech, you may have to make slight effort. And essentially the effort would be to tune the initiation of it to deeper and higher poise. If by then the intuition is somewhat developed, just the shift of the initiating point and you'll find flooding through of the intuitive influence. And so if done correctly in this way, if you know what you have to do to bring it into intuitive domain, you can bring many activities of your life into intuitive domain. Now at this point, suddenly you say, hey, I've just started gymnastics. My body is barely conscious. Can I bring it intuitive domain? Yes, but it'll take much longer. Because before you can bring to intuitive domain, you will have to mentalize the body enough and make body conscious enough. Then from there, you can plug into the intuition and then things would happen. So if you started doing gymnastics, you try to do a somersault, cartwheel, it'll be difficult. But if you started doing dance with your body, with your fingers moving like that, there it might happen more easily because that's already light and less demanding in terms of mentalization. So I think that answers enough. Okay. Whose will decides? Your will can intensify by focusing attention to raise a particular faculty or domain specific competence. Or if you open yourself generally, the divine Shakti working in you would do it in every direction. This is the example we have of Romain Palit. I've mentioned him many times before. He comes as a young man to the ashram with pretty much an ordinary capacity for anything. But under the influence of Sri Aurobindo's yoga force, and Sri Aurobindo mentions this in his correspondence with Nirod, he says within 2 years, this man suddenly starts spouting a wonderful poetry, becomes an extraordinary musician. He starts playing the sitar like a pro, and then he starts getting into literature and writes beautiful literature. And all these capacities flower out within 2 years. This is not doable unless there is a yoga force doing it. It's not humanly doable. So Sri Aurobindo points to that and says that's your evidence of the power of the yoga force. But also when he moves out of the yoga, there's a dramatic reduction of all these capacities because he's no more plugged into the yoga force. So because at that point he was relying on the force that Sri Aurobindo was pumping into him, he had not developed in himself the capacity to receive. So that made a difference. In that case, who decides? He could have by focusing, or Sri Aurobindo, who was infusing the force, could also slant, and or both could do. Last question. How does the higher mind and the mind of light relate to the intuition? In the working of the intuition in us, the higher mind represents a certain grade of working which is much larger than your embodied mind, and it already requires a certain base of familiarity with the presence of the self. Intuition comes in a higher grade of its working where it exceeds even the thought form of the higher mind. So intuition would be effectively a grade above higher mind. The mind of light begins with the infusion of the intuition into these lower gradations and turning through them towards something still higher, towards the supermind. So both of them, okay, I've answered the relationship of intuition. Mind of light literally forms with the infusion of the higher gradations, beginning with the intuition. It cannot form with anything inferior. It has to begin with intuition and all the way to the supermind, infusing into the lower gradations, particularly all the way to the physical, and transforming the embedded mind in the physical, embodied mind here. And okay. Got very important questions. Thank you for bringing these issues up. I think we will close for today. We have completed our time. I want to recapitulate the third method, the logic of it, and the fact that here, for the first time, we are directly entering in relation with higher ranges of consciousness, which are intuitive and supramental generally. Requires now a base of preparation. If you have worked on the first two methods, this becomes easy because certain things required for this are already familiar and a receptive base is there. But for those who have a natural opening to this, even without that base, you could start. But working on those two will build through complementarity the necessary receptivity as well as the access to the perception of the presence above. So just as the perception of the presence within by concentration in it and initiation from it was done in the inward movement, exactly the same thing now would turn in the upward direction with the same benefit. So the skill here, which is accessible to you more easily now, would be turned into an upward skill. But otherwise, you have the skill. It's not a new skill you're going to have to develop. So you see the sequencing of these three is extremely valuable, not essential, but it makes everything much easier. So do spend time, do work on this. And as you begin to explore this shifting of the center of thought and the familiarity with being more in the subtle awareness, subtle body form than in the gross, and the shift that it makes in the quality of thought and lightness, freedom, etc., just that, let this settle. It's easy, it's within reach, and if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the description box of the videos. The last few weeks I've been putting the email ID integralstudies.in@gmail.com on which you can put your questions, as also you can put it in the chat box. In the chat box, unfortunately, I am so far avoiding questions which are not directly related to the topic, because I would like to complete this topic as thoroughly as possible. Some of the questions which are important but not of this topic, I have noted them. I leave them there, I copy them and put it in a separate file to be taken up later. I think that's all for today. Today being the mother's birthday, we will also relate this to her in the form in which this whole practice, including the three and even the fourth method, can be taken in a single movement, is by simply opening your entire mind awareness, eventually all awareness, directly to the mother's presence and her force. But there's a caveat. It should not be the limited consciousness and form of a visualized picture. You must feel her presence, open to her presence, and know her presence larger, freer, wider, as one who presides over the whole universe, who is presiding over you. So when you feel her presence here above head, as this vast peace, as this vast light, as this vast love and presence of the mother, know her vastness, feel her vastness, enjoy her vastness, and enter in full relation to her in a complete self-giving. As you do this, implicit to that effort of opening and self-giving is all that Sri Aurobindo has described as consequence. Because as you open yourself, she can work directly into you. She fills you with her peace. She brings her light. She brings her substance into you, brings stillness and calm and clarity, raises your consciousness even above head. You'll find that she will pull you like this and you'll find yourself centered above head. I did nothing. I didn't even know I was supposed to do that. And shoop, she pulls you up and you feel here. And if you didn't know it's supposed to happen, you'll say, hey, what's happening? I need to come back. And you'll force yourself back. That's why the reading helps. When you've read and then when it happens, you say, oh, that's what it is. It was so easy. She pulled you. You didn't even have to make an effort. So sometimes it will happen to you in meditation. You're concentrating, you're feeling her presence. And then suddenly it's as if you feel pulled up. Let it happen. And then suddenly you feel as if there's a descent of her force and presence. Let it happen. Receive and widen to receive it. As widely as you can, as completely as you can. Let the presence soak into you all the way into the most material physical consciousness, if you can, as much as you can. So you will find this double movement of rising as well as descending happening spontaneously in that immersion. Or in that immersion, you may choose to consciously make the ascent and the descent of the center, but you are dwelling in her, and automatically the shift required to come to a higher grade happens there. And this is the reason why the opening to the mother's force and her presence, her love, her peace, her light, what else, is one of the most rapid and effortless in terms of method. You could say, I don't need to have read all this. I will just do that. Yes, it will work. But because you have preconceptions and limitations in your understanding, they will tend to narrow and limit what happens or what she can do directly. Because, for example, you may not realize the importance of the widening. So it happens, you say, yes. And even if there's a nudge to widen, you will instinctively resist and remain in your narrow. I feel so nice, I don't need anything more. And you stop there. So having read and understood this, when you enter in relation with her, you will find the movements happening. You'll say, yes, that's what it is. And you allow it. You participate in it. And where you feel, where is that happening? You will turn yourself to her and you'll find the movement beginning spontaneously. So it makes a huge difference when you have read and understood and made effort to practice with your effort first, and then increasingly by giving yourself an opening to her and relying on her working in you. And so that's why he says that the opening to the higher and the infusion of the substance of the higher power and luminous capacity is found in practice to be the greater part of the natural method used by the divine Shakti. And so we will more and more rely on this, but always begin with what you can do and want to do, so that you have also the joy and the initial requirement of the effort that's needed from you to begin the process. Let's take this as our intention for the coming week at least, to work on this consciously, and if possible in combination with the earlier two methods. And the ultimate objective of all this is still to open to the divine consciousness in its highest, in the supramental consciousness, so that we may become more and more instruments for the divine truth. And our entire life and all levels of our consciousness may be transformed by that truth, towards which we aspire, but now through many intermediate steps which will lead us to that. May the Divine Mother lead our steps in our aspiration, in our practice, and in our journey. Namaste.